Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the workshop, Neurorights in Chile, the Philosophical Debate, organized by the Challenge of the Future Committee of the Chilean Senate, Professor Rafael Yuste from Columbia University, and the Neuroethics Group at Alberto Hurtado University, and sponsored by Columbia Global Centers Santiago. The purpose of the workshop is to discuss the concepts involved in the Constitutional Reform Bill and the Bill on Neuroprotection of the Chilean Senate. Today, we are going to have 3 sessions, which will be moderated by me. Session C on bias and discrimination, Session D on mental augmentation and human identity, and Session E on mental privacy. This is Session C, in which we will be discussing issues related to the right to protection from algorithmic bias. That is, the idea that countermeasures to combat bias should be the norm for machine learning. We will hear comments from Alejandro Jofré, Philipp Kellmeyer, and Mariano Sigman. Alejandro Jofré is a professor and the vice chancellor of the University of Chile. He has held the positions of director and deputy director of the Center for Mathematical Modeling from the same university. Philipp Kellmeyer is a neurologist at the University Medical Center Freiburg, where he heads the Laboratory of Neuroethics and Ethics of AI in the Department of Neurosurgery. He's part of the board of the International Neuroethics Society. Mariano Sigman is an associate professor at Torcuato Di Tella University and senior researcher at CONICET, Argentina. He founded the Laboratory of Integrative Neuroscience at the University of Buenos Aires and is the director of the decision-making program of the European Human Brain Project. Now we are going to hear Alejandro Jofré. Hello, Alejandro. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. I'm going to share now a short presentation about the topic, and that's do you see now? Okay. So then the section is on bias and discrimination, right? And I'm going to focus more and more on bias aspect. And I think my colleague can talk about the discrimination and connection with bias. As was mentioned at the beginning of this workshop, this proposal of include these 5 neurorights, and in this list we are then talk about the last one, the right of protection from algorithmic bias. So these 2 concepts, bias and algorithms, are, we see complex and complex to treat with, and the connection with the algorithm and bias is very intricate, and we will then hope that we want to discuss more detail on these 2 concepts, how they are connected. So in terms of bias, you know, we have first that bias data, right? Then data, when we collect data, this data usually is biased because of the way we are collecting the data, or because of the sample is made in a very specific form, and then the bias is inside the data. And this is one of the aspects that is very difficult to have non-biased data. But there are some techniques for de-bias, to reduce the bias. I will say, we will never have data with any bias. And then bias will be always there, but we want to reduce to the amount of data, or the amount of bias in the data. So there are some technique for de-bias data. So when you have the data, then you apply an algorithm for coming from like machine learning algorithms or other algorithms, and but the algorithm itself, in the code in the algorithm, could also have the presence of a bias. So we try to apply a neutral or fair algorithm. But what is neutral algorithm? What is fair algorithm? Which is not clear, right? So, but then if we introduce in the algorithm bias data, so we are going to have as an output the same bias, right? But not always, because if the algorithm introduces some bias, and we are going to talk about that a bit, then we have this complex connection between bias data, a bias introduced by the algorithm, and then in the output we are going to have the combination of these two biases, right? So this is why it's so important to know some techniques for the bias data first, and then to code very carefully and then tune algorithms. Then tuning algorithm is something, is also a collection of techniques for testing bias in algorithms. And this is a new area in algorithmic, and it's very important because there are several ways that bias introduced in the coding when you code algorithms, right? So so we have this task for trying to reduce the bias, dividing data, tune algorithms, and also the bias output. We will come back later about the concept of tune algorithm and how important it is to know exactly what the algorithm do. Okay, so bias, any solution for bias must start with awareness that bias exists, and then how to define the bias and how to measure bias. Well, one usual statistic definition is bias is systemic deviation caused by an inaccurate estimation or sampling process. As a result of this bias, the distribution of the variable, the variable you're estimating, could be biased with respect to the original possible unknown distribution. And there are many bias categories or type of bias. But just to simplify, I can divide it in these cultural biases, can be found in our inclination to our shared personal beliefs, and cognitive bias affect our behavior and the way we make decisions. This is just a simple two-category bias. A very recent example, this is an official publication by the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean about bias and problem that may arise in the household surveys for all the analysis studies concerning COVID-19. So that is a very good example, because it's a very recent example how important is bias, even including these surveys for analyzing behavior and of the COVID-19. And the problem is that the bias process, then reducing bias from the data, from the algorithm, is becoming more and more complex, because when you look at the machine learning algorithms, at the beginning was the supervised learning, right? Then we moved to unsupervised learning, and then later to reinforced learning, and then more recent to deep learning. And then when you look at the algorithm behind this, all these stages in machine learning are becoming more and more complex and more black boxes. And black boxes in the sense that you cannot have total traceability of the steps in the algorithm when they are doing calculation and when they are choosing estimation of the parameter. One example, for example, is here. Usually, for the machine learning algorithm, you in the estimation process, you're required to look at the global optimum of a function like this, with many valleys, many hills, and then up and down. And then usually the algorithm stops before getting the global optimum. So we are always like having an approximation. And then that is a problem, because when you're to have some unbiased estimators, you're required to get exactly the global optimum. And then we're almost never getting the global optimum because of the behavior of this loss function or error function, which are very nonlinear with many up and down behavior, right? So another important problem in machine algorithm is the context, and how to introduce context in the algorithms. Cultural context, social context in the algorithms. How we can do that? And this is a joke about the great run. You lost 79 kilograms. It's a joke for showing how important is the context when you apply algorithms and in the analysis. And then there are many attempt to solve the problem of context in the algorithm, but this is still very open. From my point of view, it's still very open problem. So there are a good example of application, a controversial application of machine learning, like in justice, and then these are news from the Economist journal, and another good example is this article about how digital disinformation is destroying societies connected with biased data, but also with algorithms introducing bias. These are two, just a picture of the how Europe is trying to deal with this, introducing some regulation. And these are the article 22 about general digital regulation for some of these processes, but still is not completely solved, right, in the regulation, because of you will see that this the concept of bias and is intrinsic in the process of data, and is intrinsic in the process of coding algorithms. So it's very difficult to deal with how to regulate this application of bias data, bias algorithm in important and delicate decisions. Okay, let me talk a bit about that, about black boxes and interpretability, which is something that I have been working in the last few years. Here is I quote a recent work by Cynthia Rudin, and it's very interesting to see that over the last few years, we are, as I said, deep learning is more and more used in, for example, computer vision. But then this have led to the widespread belief that most accurate model for given data science problem must be inherently uninterpretable and complicated. This belief is I think it's wrong. But this belief is today, most people believe that if you are, when you apply machine learning algorithms, must be complicated and not interpretable. So this is one of the things I think I would like to I would like to discuss when after the talk. And then in machine learning, these black boxes are created directly from the data and an algorithm, and then you can, and it seems that these algorithms have the idea that we cannot understand how variables are being combined to make predictions. And even if one of the has a list of input variables, black box predictive model can be complicated functions of the variable, and then no human can understand how the variables are jointly related each other. So interpretable model, which provide a technical equivalent but possibly more ethical alternative to black box model, are different. They are constrained to provide better understanding of how predictions are made. I think it's for me, it's a very key point about how to not only for have more transparent algorithm, but also connected with the bias of the algorithms. then let me, for example, in one of the recent conferences, maybe you probably know that this example. Then when two images were displayed among the participants of the conference on the screen. It was a conference with people coming from finance, from computer science, from machine learning community, and so on. So one image depicted a human surgeon who could explain anything about surgery, but had a 15% chance of causing death during the surgery. Okay, this is one image. The other image showed a robotic arm that could perform the surgery with only a 2% chance of failure. So the robot was made to simulate a black box approach to artificial intelligence. And in this scenario, total trust in the robot was required. Okay? No question about could be asked about the robot, and non-specific understanding how it became to its decision would be provided. Only just the 2% statistic about the failure. Okay. And so the people, the organizer organized a vote among the participants in this conference. It was a very important conference. And the result was most of the people were voting for the robots. Okay. So even if the way the robots the algorithm for that working inside the robot were unknown, and in particular difficult to interpret. Even that, most of the people specialized, the people working on this area were choose robot as an option for this surgery. Okay, so this that shows a good example where we have with this black box and how people are feeling this black box are working, how these black boxes are solving some problems in the society, and that this problem exists in finance, but also healthcare, criminal justice, and beyond. Okay, just the same. Just to finish, just a very short example for having something Chilean. This is a picture of underground mine, and not far from Santiago, 100 kilometers south of Santiago. And in this mine, copper mine is going deeper and deeper and deeper, and then we have installed there a system capturing earthquake activity inside the underground mine. We analyze with computer, and then we do simulation, visualization, so on. But more important than that, we are dealing with risk decision. So we are monitoring in real time how the behavior of this massive rock is behaved. And then when we capture data showing that there are some risk of have a rock burst, a small earthquake, then we send a signal, some signal about, and then when you have different level of risk, we send different signal. So in that way, from this data, we realized later that from this data, we were able to capture the risk aversion of each worker. We are able to go inside the behavior about risk on the worker. So that was a problem because of with the workers and with the union workers, because we were capturing more information that was required. But it was just very natural in this problem, because we really want to send information real time to alert the worker in case of an earthquake. Okay, so that just showing how important is to know exactly what is inside the algorithm, to not only to have more transparent algorithm, but also to avoid or to reduce the amount of bias. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Now we are going to hear Philipp Kellmeyer. Please, Philipp, the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Before I begin, I just wanted to say short word. So, muchas gracias a los organizadores del simposio por su amable invitación. Hace casi exactamente 20 años pasé un tiempo maravilloso en Chile. Por aquel entonces era un estudiante de medicina que hacía prácticas en el programa regional de bioética de la UPS con el profesor Fernando Lolas y sus compañeros. He conservado recuerdos muy fuertes y impresiones duraderas de esta época. En particular, siempre me impresionó el trabajo de mis amigos chilenos en materia de derechos humanos y ética. Por eso es un honor y un placer para mí estar hoy aquí y poderme dirigirme a ustedes. So thank you again very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you also, Alejandro, for introducing the technical side of machine learning bias. In fairness, I'm going to talk a little bit now about the interaction between human and artificial intelligence and how that can lead to biases in the area of neurotechnology. So the background situation is that we have something that people call technological superconvergence. You showed that AI is not one thing, Alejandro, but really a system of systems. And in that particular case, you have the interplay between our ability to collect vast amounts of data, big data, we have deep neural networks, and of course, we have more sophisticated sensor technology than we ever had before. And in the area of neuroscience and neurotechnology, if you take one particular type of sensor, for example, an EEG, here, this enables, of course, an exciting new generation of AI-driven neurotechnologies, brain-computer interfaces that can help paralyzed neurological patients to operate service robots and so forth. So this is really an exciting technological development. And this has also spawned the interest of companies, big and small companies at the interface of neurotechnology and neuroscience who are now actively working on building consumer-directed and consumer-oriented devices for collecting brain data on a larger scale. So outside of the medical domain, outside of clinical applications, we will see an increase in the way in which brain data are being collected and made available. And you mentioned, Alejandro, the interpretability problem, the black box problem, and maybe to illustrate this once more is here that we have a family of machine learning approaches that we understand very well, that have a high degree of interpretability, but are maybe not so accurate, do not perform as well as other algorithms. And then, of course, everybody's now working with neural nets. We ourselves use them to analyze EEG data for clinical purposes, and it's an exciting development, but the cost is that it lowers accuracy. And if we then build systems in which we have brains interacting very closely with technology, like a closed-loop brain-computer interface, for example, where you use brain activity to operate a service robot or so, everybody talks about the black box problem of AI, the problem of low interpretability. But from the perspective of a neuroscientist, I would say there's also a black box problem of the brain in that we don't really understand how most complicated brain processes work, cognitive processes, emotional processes. And so what you effectively have here is two black boxes in interaction. And this raises a lot of ethical issues, and Professor Yuste and other colleagues and I have written about this, that there are new ethical priorities now at this intersection of neurotechnology and AI. And today's session is about bias. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about bias, focus on how bias comes into play here. And you could say that because we understood the previous generation of algorithms fairly well, there was not a lot of discussion about fairness in machine learning prior to, say, this is of course a cartoon illustration, but prior to 2012, when the first powerful AlexNet, deep neural networks came on the scene and blew away the competition in computer vision competitions. Now, suddenly, everybody's talking about fairness and bias in machine learning. And so, Alejandro, you already talked about the technical aspects, but maybe one more illustration that from the point of view of data science and statistics, bias and variance are sort of inherent trade-offs that we have to acknowledge when we deal with data. So you can have statistics that have a high variance but a very low bias because they're very close to target. But you can also have data sets that have a high bias and a high variance, where you basically the likelihood that you will get the right target, identify the right pattern, is fairly low, and getting from here to here, where you have low bias and low variance, is an incredibly difficult task. One reason is that not only data structures are biased, as Alejandro pointed out, but because data structures and the way in which we collect and classify and label data is driven by our own understanding, our conceptual understanding, and our own cognitive processes. Human cognitive biases play an important role here. So remember that there was this groundbreaking work by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and colleagues on human cognitive biases, so the tendency to use particular mental shortcuts, heuristics that lead to systematic distortions in decision-making. For example, recency heuristic or availability heuristic, and that's sort of at the cognitive level of the individual making a decision. But aggregated, these can lead to sort of pervasive cultural biases. And of course, at the societal level, we have also structures like structural injustices, political injustice, and discrimination that impose another layer of bias. So apart from the sort of machine learning or machine problems of interpretability, and the bias variance dilemma, we also have the human tendency for biased decision-making. And the family of known and identifiable psychological biases has vastly expanded in the last couple of years. This is just an illustration to show you how many different cognitive biases are now recognized by psychologists. But how does this translate into AI bias? And here's, I think, a very telling and illustrative example in which here a Twitter user was highlighting the fact that Google algorithm for recognizing photos had no problems identifying skyscrapers, airplanes, or even a graduation photo here of the person that wears the characteristic hat, but was classifying dark-skinned individuals as gorillas. And Google, of course, apologized for this, but in the best tradition of engineering thinking, the way that they solved, in quotes, this problem was not by building a fairer algorithm, but taking away the ability of the algorithm to recognize gorillas, which was only realized because field biologists who used the same algorithm to recognize gorillas in wild photographs and photo traps suddenly couldn't use the algorithm anymore for that purpose. So this is, I think, the kind of algorithmic or technical fix that's not very helpful in combating biases. But it's also in the medical domain. So if you remember, there was a big breakthrough in deep neural networks that could identify cancerous lesions in photos of skins. And if you look at the original screenshot here from the promotional video from Nature promoting this, this video, you can perhaps also easily recognize that these are only light-skinned individuals, and it's now been shown that AI-driven dermatology apps can leave dark-skinned patients behind because they've been optimized on data from light-skinned individuals. And this is sort of then a racial bias, ethnic bias that is sort of built in and spills over into this medical application. So there's a real problem in the way, and Alejandro talked about this also, biases get perpetuated, and biases are ubiquitous. So not only data structures are biased, but also programmers, also users. And what you then end up with is basically a biased system. So this is an important message, that bias is ubiquitous because it's a feature of the way that we understand and structure the world. And strategy for bias mitigation, you talked about fair machine learning, but there are also the idea of developmental or evolutionary AI, or debiasing individuals that are doing these data structures, or behavioral psychology, ideas from nudging, limiting the use of AI in socially sensitive applications. But these are all not trivial or easy fixes, because it turns out that it's incredibly hard to debias humans. So this is just one example from medicine, where they try to debias human doctors from making biased decisions in the emergency room. And after the debiasing training, the doctors acted even worse, because they had an overarching bias blind spot, in which they thought, oh, because I had the bias sensitivity training and have now been debiased, I don't make biased decisions anymore. And this was sort of even led to even stronger problems in decision-making and biased decision-making. And so behavioral economics, nudging is one example in which people try, by restructuring the environment and giving behavioral cues in the environment, you could direct people's behavior to minimize biases. But I find this incredibly problematic, because it's paternalistic, and who will make the decisions in what direction to nudge. And so perhaps another approach would be to say, okay, from a developmental perspective, the way we develop our moral decision-making is by getting instructions from our parents, then interacting with our peers in school before we get out to the world. And so maybe having this kind of developmental lens to say, okay, we need to train these algorithms to behave in a fairer and less biased way under ecologically valid yet constrained circumstances before we put them out in the world could be one approach. Because most strategies for bias mitigation in AI are rather prescriptive and top-down, so things like nudging, active debiasing, limiting the use in fair machine learning. And we need to find a way to have strategies that preserve people's freedom and are not too top-down, but sort of maybe a little bit more bottom-up. And so I think this is where the research should go in that respect, because we don't really have those kinds of models yet. And so problems in automated debiasing of data. We need new educational strategies for debiasing. We need to raise questions on the ethics of nudging, choice architecture. And we try to do this in Freiburg in our research focus, responsible artificial intelligence, responsible AI, in which we have several research projects on that topic, but also engage in science outreach and communication with the community to improve upon this problem. So, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Philipp. Now we're going to hear Mariano Sigman. Hi, Mariano. The screen is yours.
Hello, Abel. How are you? Thanks so much for the invitation. I'll share my screen also as the others. So I will, let me see if this works. You're seeing it there, right?
Yes.
My screen.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So those were two extremely interesting talks for me. I imagine it's been the case also for all the rest of the audience. I thought I could play a little bit of a different role here on a way, the way I see it is that there has been a voice for mathematics and for algorithms and computer science, and on a way also through Philipp to technology and to brain science. And I would like to speak a little bit the voice of experimental psychology or behavioral science. And I would like, because I mean, this whole thing is embedded in an idea which is neurorights. I thought it would be interesting to also raise the issue that I think that in the end, what we need are mind rights. And the brain is very important because, of course, it's the organ that produces the mind. But we should not forget that, and we should be kind of careful on what is the ultimate goal of what we want to protect and what we want to enhance, which I think in the end, it's human experience. It's our consciousness, our feelings, our thoughts. And of course, the brain is an extremely powerful and maybe the more powerful vehicle to actually trigger and nudge and have a control and have a freedom of thought. But it's of course not the only one, and I would like to speak this voice also as a way of pronouncing ourselves about biases. But I thought it would be interesting to begin with an example that has been well trodden, which is the idea. I've been pretty much involved in this idea. Actually, in Chile, we began this school of neuroscience, cognitive science, and education, which was a very flourishing school for many years, in which the aim was to understand what was the right bridge and the right metaphors and the right tools and the right ideas that could be used from years and years and people doing brain science to improve our education. And so it's a bit of a similar discussion that now we are having here in the grounds of ethics and in the grounds of freedom and in the grounds of power, but in that case, it was in the grounds of education. And John Brewer, he's the president of the James McDonald Foundation, and he was one of the founders, the founder of this school, had this now very famous paper, which was the idea that like education and neuroscience were a bit too far. He had this metaphor coming from the famous film of A Bridge Too Far. And so I'll just read the first words because I think they may help us. He goes like, brain science fascinates teachers and educators. And of course, fascination is a problem here, just as it fascinates all of us. When I speak to teachers about applications of cognitive science in the classroom, there's always a question or two about the right brain versus the left brain and the educational promise of brain-based curricula. I answer that these ideas have been around for a decade, are often based on misconceptions and overgeneralizations of what we know about the brain, and have, and that's the most important part, little to offer to educators. Education applications of brain science may come eventually, but as of now, neuroscience has little to offer teachers in terms of informing classroom practice. There is, however, a science of mind, cognitive science, that can serve as a basic science for the development of an applied science of learning and instruction. So his argument is, of course, I mean, brain science ultimately will be the way to inform education, but now it may be too early. And we may maybe be distracting ourselves if we focus too much on that, on the idea that there are ways of actually making the same uses that may be much more powerful coming from cognitive science. And so I think this is an important conversation to have, and that's the one I wanted to bring. And I'll give 3 examples of that, and that's going to be my case for today. So let me give what I think are like breakthroughs that in the last 20 years or so have been kind of where we've seen the capacity of interactions between machines and brains directly in all sorts of different spectacular ways. I chose 3 examples. They are my choice. There are many more, of course, but I think they're prominent, and I would like to compare these with what has happened in the last years in the domain of cognitive science. So one of them was, of course, the paper by Ramirez and colleagues, where they could actually manipulate directly on a synapse and enforce a memory on an animal that never existed. This, if we are thinking about neurorights, this is a very important question. It's the idea that someone can make us believe that something that never happened, happened. So they not only can control our thoughts and biases, but they can bias our notion and recognition of our own past, which of course is the window to our identity. And that's something we have to be very worried. It's very important. If there's this possibility, then we have to have this meeting to see how we restrict and how we put boundaries to these ideas. But something we also need to know is that 30 years ago, Rediger and McDermott published a famous paper in which they showed that they could enforce a false memory that never existed with very high probability, with very high control, without using a single electrode, just using words. And so that's what you see in this graph here. This is the famous memory. So if I present you a list of words, you'll tend to remember the first word and the last word. That's the curve that you see decaying and then mounting up again. That's very, very famous and old result. And then the idea is that I can try to present you words that are kind of around a certain word that will never be presented, and that's the lure, on a way that I'll give you the false impression that something that never had been said has been said. And so they had this idea that they were trying to directly trigger a memory. And what you see here is in this dotted line is the probability of promoting this memory just with words, no electrodes, no technology, no, I mean, basic and pure cognitive science. And this capacity exists, and we, of course, we all live with it, with this, that the fact that we are continuously populated with memories that actually never existed. And they're very profound and effective mechanisms which live in the domain of cognitive science and experimental psychology, which today, I think, may be more today, once again, that's not forever, but today may be more relevant than thinking on how we can impregnate memories through direct effect on synapses. Here's another example. This comes from Miguel Nicolelli's labs. Once again, there are thousands of versions of this now. And so this is a brain-to-brain interface. So the idea is that there's a rat that's sensing the world and so makes information. This information has all what we've seen now. It's biased by visual biases and so on. It's kind of inferred to a certain category or to a certain state by algorithms that have all the problems that we've seen now. But then this algorithm eventually flies to a different place where there is a different rat or mice, which has this information injected in its motor cortex, so that now, on a way, this rat is making decisions based on the experience of this other rat. And of course, once again, this has happened forever in social interactions. It's called language. It's the idea that somehow I can have an experience that will shape the behaviors, the beliefs, the emotions of another person. But the point here, and it's a very spectacular one, is that this actually happens without just with communication, in a brain-to-brain communication, without any of the effectors of language or communication that we've seen until here. So this, of course, is a very important example, but once again, I want to bring the power of, like today, to raise what is our situation today with like zero technology. This is once again a very, very famous demonstration, work by Johnson and Goldstein, where they studied the propensity of people to donate their, or this is data from 2003, to donate their organs in different countries in Europe. And of course, this is a very fundamental decision. It has to do, and it's a profoundly ethical decision. It has to do with our conceptions of life and death and very, very fundamental things of our existence. And it doesn't take a huge statistician to see that something strange about this distribution is that it's by model. There are no grays. And if you try to find structure, you will not find it. So you will say, well, maybe it depends on Latin countries versus Saxon countries or Northern countries versus, but you see Germany, no one donates. In Austria, everyone does. And you can go and any hypothesis that you make about this will not work until you understand that the only thing that's relevant here is actually how the law enforces the different forms on how this option is being made. So some countries tell you, if you want to donate organs, just put a cross here. Those are the ones in the left. No one donates organs. Another one say, if you do not want to donate organs, then put a cross here. And so the only thing which is changed is the default. And what is common to people in Spain, in the UK, in Argentina, in Chile, is that those are very hard decisions, which we do not want to make. And so we directly opt to the default that has been given to us. So once again, if we're speaking about restricting human freedoms of experience, of mind, of thought, of decision, we should be aware that we are living today in a world in which just the form of a paper can convey and direct what we choose on the more profound aspects which decide our existence. And I would like to finish with a different example where I would like to present situations in which brain science is needed. Because of course, I mean, the capacity that we've developed in the last 20 years for inferring mental states from brain states is formidable and has opened windows which before were completely opaque. And so this is yet another example of, so you have to start beginning the situations in which you cannot express your own mind. And so these situations, typically you can think of patients like vegetative patients, you can think the mind of a dreamer, that cannot convey their mental experience to other people in any way. Or for instance, you can think a very interesting and is case, which in a way was raised by Philipp in his trajectory of how algorithms should build, is the mind of an infant, the mind of an agent that cannot still express the content of its own mind. And so, of course, although there's no verbal expressions, there has been a very flourishing science showing that we can infer some of these aspects. So this is the work here by Jacques Meller, where he showed that he was presenting different languages, alternating languages between Japanese and Italian, or Dutch and Italian, I think, and to babies, newborns, like literally hours out of the womb. And they had a measure which was the sucking rate, or you could measure also pupil dilatation or movement of eyes. Those are implicit measures of behavior that you can ask to know what this particular agent is encoding and what is not, what kind of categories we identify and so on, patterns of our own thoughts. And so the discovery was that when there was a change of language within broad categories, this was not like between Italian and Spanish, but if it went from Italian to Dutch, then the baby understood that something very different had happened. And so you begin to understand these elements. But I would like to close with an example that I did myself with Stanislas Dehaene and his wife, Ghislaine Dehaene, when we were working together a few years ago. And so what we did is we had this paper on measuring dynamics using MRI, which, as you know, is a very slow tool, but somehow we could unfold the brain dynamics from that, which is what you are seeing here in different colors, of people, adults and babies, listening to sentences. And what you see on the left had been known for years, which is that when you listen to sentence, you activate the auditory cortex, which are those two big blobs on the lateral part of the brain, on the temporal part of the brain. And then information goes to a region called Broca region, which is known because it has to do with the articulation of language, the production of language. But of course, you're only listening to sentences. And so what this showed and taught us was that actually, even when we are silently listening to sentences, we are producing them mentally. And that's our way to understand language, is in a way we resonate to it, which then led, of course, to this whole field of mirror neurons and so on. We repeat this on those who were 3 months old, but then Marcela Peña in Chile did that with newborns, and she found the same thing, which is that this exact same pattern holds in babies, which are yet have to quadruple their lifetime to begin uttering their first words. So why do I think this is important in the context of this conversation is that this maybe would have never seen by overt and direct behavior. And this is important because in a way, what this is telling me is that this baby in a way is trying to speak, is making an implicit effort to speak. This is an extrapolation I'm making from the data, but one which I think is reasonable. And this is in the essence of pedagogy, and it's in the essence of solidarity, and it's in the essence of human companionism, which is that you identify a problem that the other person has, and then eventually you react. You see a person who wants to cross the street and they cannot cross the street, and then you help them cross the street. For that, you have the capacity of seeing this. And the problem with human existence and with human thought is that very often this expression is opaque. So one way which I think technology is very useful, this is a particular case, of course it's also dangerous, but it's very useful, is on making human thought more transparent, and by that making it more visible to the necessities that people may have. And I think this very clearly applies to patients and to infants. I mean, I think that I could have gone through, and we've worked a lot on that, on the literature of how it has changed for vegetative state patients. Those are patients where people for many years had the thought, which was a very reasonable inference, which is that they did not have a mental life. And now there is very clear science showing that for some of them, they have a very profound and rich mental life, which of course raises very, very important ethical questions. And last slide, just to close with, of course, a very obvious and basic idea of what I've been trying to say is, I mean, neurotechnology is a very important, and the mixture, Philipp, you were saying, of this combination with the sensors and AI and so on, builds kind of a niche for all what we are discussing today. But this is not happening only in the grounds of neuroscience. Like, just to give an example, CRISPR also has raised a whole new wave on the possibilities that we have to manipulate our identity for good and for bad. And of course, this has come inevitably with also an explosion of ethical conversations about this. But in the same way that I mentioned, our manipulation of identity has not begun with CRISPR. I mean, you know that eugenics has been for years and years and centuries with us, and the idea that behaviorally and without any capacity of manipulating our genes, or even without knowing the existence of our genes, the idea of purity and race and bias and hateness about that has been with us for years and years. And so, on a way, coming back to what I said in the beginning, I would like to come back to this idea. I think that it's fundamental to have the symposium we are having now and all these days, Abel, what you and Rafa are organizing. I think every now and then it's also important to remind that in the very end, the reason the neurons are important is because they forge the existence of our mental life. And this is in a way what we would like to protect and to give freedom and liberty and all the life that we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariano, and thank you all. I'm sorry we don't have time for a discussion. We are waiting for speakers from panel D, but we can make like one question to close our session. So, do you have any question? Well, I have one brief question that I think that brings together some ideas regarding the mind and algorithms, bias and discrimination to briefly talk about. It's related more to discrimination and transparency. There are potential neurotechnological applications that have been recently discussed in the neuroethics community, in which we could potentially apply machine learning algorithm to brain data from us assessing career-specific skills related, for instance, to medical practice or law enforcement, and use that assessment for making employment decisions. This kind of application can help, obviously, to avoid employment decisions that can have very bad consequences for the society that relies on those professionals, but at the same time, they can have long-term bad consequences for employees in terms of discriminations, for instance. So, do you think that this potential application is problematic? If so, how one could conciliate the employees and the public interests, and specifically, do you think that transparency, for instance, could help being able to give reasons to support those decisions, and so that the employees can also work on those reasons, and so on? What do you think?
I can start if you want, because
go ahead. You can start. And...
Yeah, sorry. I'll make a brief. I think that the dangers of what you mentioned are obvious. I would like to speak about also the possibilities of this, and it relates to things that were said before in the talks, which is that one key element to avoid biases is to be aware that you have them. And the reason I think, and so people are afraid of using algorithms to make important human decisions, like in mental health or in recruitment. But the point is that when humans do that, they are making all sorts of judgments. We have all sorts of biases. So I think that there's an opportunity, and a famous case for this is decisions that have to make in automated cars, where they have to make the choice of where they sacrifice the driver, or they will. So I think that we have to recognize something which is very important, which is that when you have to explicitly write an algorithm, there is no more room for saying, like, kind of, this decision is one that happens in the underground of consciousness, and I just make it without being clear that I'm making it. So, and I would like to frame this also in the idea of Philipp, which is, in development, there's a transition from non-symbolic to symbolic thought. So you begin making judgments which are based on core learnings, and you have moral intuitions, but eventually at some point, those are grounded in symbols, and you have reasons why you believe what you believe. And I think that although this happens for many domains, it does not happen for all of them, including Abel, all the ones you mentioned. When people recruit people, they're not aware of what arguments they're using for this recruitment. And if they were to be aware, they would realize that they're using arguments that they would not be happy with. So I think that there is one opportunity, the inclusion of AI, which is at least this will have to be explicit. It has a cost, but it also has an opportunity on honesty, which is we are explicitly saying what is the algorithm which we use to make a decision in those sensible social domains.
Well, in the same vein, when we as an academic, we have been all of us be part of this selection committee for new people in the departments, and when we enter the room for selecting this as part of the process, we always enter with our own beliefs and bias, right? And then I think automatic selection or selection using algorithms is an opportunity, as I was saying recently, for to have an really transparent process, transparent criteria, and then if you're using a machine learning for doing that, for me is mandatory that these machine learning steps algorithms were required to be totally transparent, and this is connected with the interpretability property that I mentioned with previous speaker Philipp. And I read Fefe. And then and now I think it's possible today. In the picture that Philipp showed you, what was you saw that different complexity of the algorithm, right, from the linear to more and more complex. But now today it's possible. Today, any committee using machine learning or this kind of algorithm for selecting should be put in advance to the candidate. This is the way we are going to evaluate. We're using this algorithm with this and these steps. And then, like today when you evaluate project or people, you say you're going to be evaluated in some skills, this percentage, another skills are percentage, the same, a bit, of course, more complex because they're going to be an algorithm. But today it's possible to be more transparent and with more interpretability property for the selection algorithm.
Yeah. Maybe just one point from the decision science perspective. You know, this is the work of Gerd Gigerenzer and people that show that under conditions of uncertainty, so if you don't know what the future is like, more information is not always better for modeling. But sometimes, so for example, all the machine learning models are using historical data for model fitting. So you use data from the past to model the future. And that works well under conditions of risk. So when you know that the future will be exactly like the past, then you can make good predictions. But that's very rarely the case in complex human decision-making processes like recruitment, like medical decision-making, because it's become so personalized and like every situation is a little bit different. You also have to use other kinds of heuristics and even things like intuition, which are in a sense also pattern recognition mechanisms, but that have been sort of overfitted to certain situations and that are often better under conditions of substantial fallacy to think that more data, more information is always better to predict the future. But that's only the case if the future is going to be like the past, and that's very rarely the case in complicated human affairs. So we do not have to, we should not only rely on data and modeling and machine learning, but need other orthogonal ways for deciding things also.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Philipp, Alejandro, and Mariano, for this insightful conversation on algorithmic bias. Well, after a short break, we will have session D on mental augmentation and human identity. So see you in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. It's good to see you, Mariano and Philipp.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
It was a pleasure. Sure.
Hello, welcome to session D on mental augmentation and human identity. In this session, we will be discussing issues related to the right to equal access to mental augmentation. That is, the idea that there should be established guidelines at both international and national levels regulating the development and application of mental enhancement neurotechnologies. These guidelines should be based on the principle of justice and guarantee equality of access to all citizens. Also, we will be discussing how mental augmentation may or may not change what makes us human and how we should approach this issue. We will hear comments from Inmaculada de Melo-Martín, Arlene Sales, Luca Valera, and Anna Wexler. Inmaculada de Melo-Martín is a professor of medical ethics in the Division of Medical Ethics at Weill Cornell Medical College. Her research interests include bioethics and the philosophy of sciences. Arlene Sales is a senior researcher at the Center for Research Ethics and Bioethics at Uppsala University and director of the Neuroethics program at the Center for Philosophical Investigation in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Luca Valera is an associate professor of philosophy and director of the Bioethics Center at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He was a professor of medical anthropology at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore di Roma and of human ecology and sustainability at the Università Campus Biomedico di Roma. Anna Wexler is an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy of the Perlman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. She studies the ethical, legal, and social issues surrounding emerging technology. Now, we are going to hear Inmaculada de Melo-Martín. Hello, Inmaculada, the screen is yours. Please turn on your microphone.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I am terribly sorry that this is online rather than in real life so that I could be in Chile. So, buenos días to todos los chilenos. I am going now to share my screen. Is it okay? Yes, okay. So the title of the panel is, as you just heard, Mental Augmentation and Human Identity. And I am actually going to focus on the main title, on this neuro right that has been proposed. And my focus is going to be actually on the issue of augmentation rather than on the issue of identity. So I'm going to just remind everybody of what this right entails. There should be established guidelines at both international and national levels regulating the development applications of mental enhancement neurotechnologies. These guidelines should be based on the principle of justice and guarantee equality of access to all citizens. I am going to focus particularly on that last aspect. So let me begin by saying that I think it's a great thing that we think about regulating and reflecting on technologies before they are developed rather than when we have already them implementing when they are already implemented. So this is a fantastic idea to be doing this. And that I support, of course, many of the underlying assumptions about the importance of regulating and protecting many of the aspects that these neuro rights are trying to protect. But what I am going to do actually is call attention to some wrinkles, some questions, some concerns that might arise in the context of trying to implement these rights. So I'm going to focus actually on three of those concerns. These are not the only ones, but I think they are important. So one of them, a general one actually, that seems important is that the fact that we have that proclaim certain kinds of rights doesn't mean that those rights are going to be respected. So I have here obviously the clear instance of healthcare, access to healthcare, that is certainly not guaranteed to the citizens of many countries. So obviously obviously proclaiming these rights doesn't mean that these rights are going to be respected, and this is something that we need to take into account in this process of thinking about how to implement these guidelines. So the concerns that I have are actually related to conceptual issues. So one of those concerns is, what does this right aim to guarantee? So presumably we want to guarantee equal access, but to what exactly? The aim seems to be to allow people to have access to mental enhancements, neuromental enhancements. The question is that it's difficult to determine actually what an enhancement is. And this is so for several reasons. So an enhancement in relation to what? Is it to the individual who is going to be enhanced? That means, for example, that someone who has some cognitive impairment might be enhanced by simply allowing the person to do things that they couldn't do before. Or is it related to normal functioning? Are we going to think about equal access when the issue is not just to improve a particular baseline, but to actually get people to have what is usually called normal functioning? Or is this related to actually to radical changes in human mental capacities and cognitive capacities? So obviously, depending on what we mean by enhancement, according to any of these, we would have very different questions about access to them. The other issue related to also to enhancement is enhancing what? What is that the goal is? It is to enhance a particular skill, and that's what we want to give access to. Or is it to ensure that the skill actually improves the individual? This is related to the next concern, so that it would be more clear what the concern is here. So a right to equal access actually presupposes the goodness of what we have a right to access. It would be obviously not very sensical to give people to right to things that we consider are bad for human beings. But that is might be a challenge. The idea that actually enhancements, neuro enhancements, are good for people. So clearly, not everything that is good is better when we have more of it. Some things might just, imagine, for example, memory. Memory is good to have it. It's good to have it in certain amounts, whatever that amount might be. But perhaps in certain contexts, having too much memory is a problem because we want to be able to forget, and that might actually be a benefit. Attention would be another aspect of these enhancements. Attention and the ability to have enhanced attention might be very good in some contexts, but not so good in other contexts. So it might be difficult to determine what an appropriate enhancement is, given that enhancements, what we think of something as an enhancement, as an improvement, depends actually on the context in which those enhancements are actually implemented. So when the enhancement is chosen, or what enhancements are chosen, can actually change how we evaluate them in the future, precisely because of this co-evolution of technology and values. So one of the things that we need to be concerned with is actually this co-evolution at the fact that what it might appear to us in a particular context to be an enhancement might not be so in the future, either because our values change and we don't think it's good anymore, that is an improvement, or because the context in which those enhancements are being implemented actually change. The last aspect that I want to discuss is that usually for many of these traits that we are thinking about enhancing, the traits are chosen both because we value them in our societies, but also because they offer to those who have them some competitive advantage. Now, that might not be the reason why they are chosen, but if in fact, it usually is the case that it offers that advantage. Again, think about memory, attention, of course, intelligence, and other cognitive capacities. But this creates some problems, given that that is the category of enhancements that we normally think of. It can be self-defeating to give access to everybody if what we are thinking is about improving society, for example. You know, if we all will be in the same state, if we all get those enhancements, things actually will not change. It might be that it might be good for societies to have more intelligent people, but again, whether it is good for societies to have people with more memory or more attention or whatever other cognitive capacity is going to depend on the particular context in which those enhancements are going to be implemented. This can also create a race to enhance people, to improve something like what we see now with technologies, with, you know, phones, for example, or computers. Every year or every 2 months, we get a new enhancement, something that the computer does better. So this could also be a problem, obviously, in the context of enhancing human beings. And the last concern is this about we tend to think that we should enhance certain things because we value them, or again, offer them some competitive advantage. But also we have the question of what happens with the traits that are not valued, that are in fact undervalued, so that we can actually determine that we want to enhance memory, but what happens to people, or people who have traits like kindness or appreciation of beauty. So would those traits be disregarded because of this emphasis on enhancing cognitive capacities? So I think I'm going to stop there, and I am going to stop now sharing my screen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Inmaculada. Now we are going to hear Arlene Sales. Hi, Arlene, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank the organizers of this event. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as Inma, I would love for this to be an in-person conference, so probably next time. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So let's see whether that works. Okay. Okay, can you see it? Yeah. Yeah. Great. Yeah. So in fact, the topic of my talk broadly is neurotechnology and humanness, but in fact, my focus again is going to be on humanness. And there is a reason for this, as we know, the development and application of neurotechnology to alleviate diseases, to enhance intellectual capacities, raise a number of concerns. The call for neurorights attempts to address those concerns, and one of the concerns, one of the worries of many people has to do with the extent to which, or whether those neurotechnologies might actually impact and even threaten humanness itself. I found it really interesting that even yesterday in the opening remarks, Dean Silva called for rethinking the human. He said, repensar lo humano. Actually, Dr. Yuste talked about or suggested when describing neurorights that they are there to protect the human. And Senator Girardi also discussed the future in which humans are changed and wondered about what that would be like, or what that would mean. So obviously there is a lot of interest and concern with this possibility that humanness somewhat will be not only affected, but negatively affected by neurotechnological interventions and so on. So My goal here is modest. I'm not going to tell what humanness is. I rather would like to really call for more reflection on the issue of humanness when we start having any kind of normative or legal discussion, actually. So what types of claims are usually made or we can relate to humanness? In the relevant literature, there are a number of articles that appear to show some concern with the fact that emerging neurotechnologies might alter humans' conception of what humanness is. So I call that an epistemic claim. It's not necessarily making the ontological claim that neurotechnologies will change humanness, but rather is saying it will change what people think humanness is. Then we have the ontological claim that some neurotechnologies might in fact affect traits, properties, capacities, and so on that humans as such presumably have, and that make them qualitative, different in quality. And then we have the ethical issue, which, and again, there are a few articles that focus on this point. Is it morally correct, or is it a bad thing if people's conceptions on humanness change? Is it a bad thing if actually humanness changes in itself? So I think it's important to focus on the fact that settling one issue does not necessarily lead to settling the others. And by this, I mean the following. Let's say that neurotechnological interventions actually modify what we believe humans are. They affect our perception of what we are. That doesn't necessarily mean in itself that they also affect us ontologically, that they also affect us in what we are. So I think it's important, even though these claims are usually discussed at the same time, and often there is a tendency to go from one to the other, these are still different claims and they raise different issues. Now, the thing is, so once we know that there are a number of issues involved, we can go to, well, but what is humanness from an ontological perspective? What do we understand by humanness? And this is kind of a funny question. Funny in the sense that up to now, we didn't necessarily have to, at least in everyday life, we didn't necessarily have to ask ourselves whether somebody was human. The human was easily recognizable. And there was, of course, a tendency to think that a human was somebody who shared a number of observable psychological and physiological characteristics and membership in a genetic lineage. And that was enough. And yet, however, that descriptive understanding does not seem to be enough when we concern on, when we start focusing on the concerns of people with regards to neurotechnologies. So within psychology, research on humanness is relatively recent and often it's related to research on dehumanization. The idea is that we can learn about humanness by focusing on violations of humanness. Let's put it that way. So that would be dehumanization. So for example, Haslam identifies two senses of humanness that correspond to two different forms of dehumanization. So he says humanness can be understood as uniqueness. That means that humanness is a collection of unique characteristics and attributes. Mostly they are related to socialization and culture. He identifies, for example, complex emotions, moral sensibility, a sophisticated cognition, appreciation of art, for example, and things like that. And he says denying humanness in this sense leads to seeing others as lacking complex emotions, as animal-like, as animalistic. Actually, he calls this animalistic dehumanization. There is another type of humanness that corresponds to another type of dehumanization, and that is humanness as human nature. So this entails conceiving of humanness as a set of characteristics that are typically or centrally human, even if not uniquely human, such as cognitive flexibility and emotionality. So lay people, he says, tend to connect such traits to inborn biological, deeply rooted predispositions, and thus see them as less variable across cultures. So he says denial of this kind of humanness, that is denial of humanness understood as human nature, leads to seeing humans as lacking in emotionality and individual agency, as rigid and somewhat passive. In short, he says, as object-like. He calls this type of dehumanization mechanistic dehumanization. So it becomes obvious that when it comes to addressing people's concerns regarding neurotechnologies and how they might alter humanness, the concern seems to be the latter. It seems to be that the line between the human and the non-human, specifically machines, will be blurred. And this is a problem. And it is interesting, we can go back to a number of articles, but particularly one by Chupat, where he mentions a DBS user who says that she feels like a robot, for example, less of an agent and less emotional and so on and so forth. So it seems that the sense of humanness that is involved in concerns about new interventions is human nature, humanness as human nature. So the thing is, though, that means that we have to pivot to a conversation on human nature. And if there is a topic that has been discussed for ages and ages, and a topic upon which there is no consensus is human nature, we can say that one of the most prevalent views, certainly by the public, but it has played an important role in philosophy in the past, is essentialism. And of course, for the essentialist, biological species have an inner nature that is expressed in a core set of intrinsic and fixed properties, either innate or as a result of a disposition. And this essence fulfills certain functions and is transmitted from generation to generation. Now, of course, the essentialist approach has been challenged by the Darwinian theory of evolution that proposes a more dynamic understanding of human nature that allows for variation over and at a time. Now, the acknowledgement of this, of the importance of variability has shaped the debate on human nature since then. At times, it has led to a skepticism regarding the notion of human nature, with some biologists and philosophers of science saying, or philosophers of biology saying, we shouldn't even mention the term, we shouldn't use the term human nature, it's too loaded and it's too confusing. Others have proposed revised versions of essentialism, and others finally have decided to provide different understandings that are non-essentialist. So they have shied away from essentialism without giving up on the notion of human nature. Instead, they propose a more or less, actually, a dynamic understanding. Why do I say more or less? Because in fact, you can see there that within non-essentialism, again, there is no unified theory of what human nature is. And there are some accounts, and actually widely discussed accounts, such as the nomological, the history trait cluster, developmental systems, that even though they agree in their rejection of essentialism, they do not agree regarding the extent to which human nature should be understood in a very dynamic sense. For example, the developmental systems account indeed favors the idea that human nature can only be understood in terms of mechanisms and processes underlying observable traits, and not in terms of traits. So why am I putting this or raising this issue? Why is this relevant to a discussion on, for example, neurotechnologies, enhancement, any kind of enhancement, and so on? Well, in fact, in general, there seems to be a kind of the underlying assumption that the alteration of humanness is either prima facie problematic or just wrong. And I think that this raises at least two issues. One is, again, is there alteration? And the fact is that in order to answer the question of whether there is alteration, we have to be clear as to what we mean by humanness. Certainly, on an essentialist perspective, That is, if it is actually the case that there are specific sets of traits that humans as such have, and that those traits are targeted specifically by some neurotechnologies, and they are altered, then of course on that view, it is relatively easy to see why the concern would be with altering human nature, humanness. But however, though, if one holds a dynamic understanding of human nature, that is not necessarily the case, because dynamic understanding, certainly a number of dynamic understandings of human nature do not necessarily hold that what makes us human is properties, but rather some mechanisms that are in constant interaction with a number of environments, bodily and cultural and symbolic environments. And that means that it is not necessarily the case that some interventions might actually produce the change that essentialists would say is produced. So this with regards to the ontology of it. But as I said before, there is another assumption that is usually made regarding this issue, and that is that if there is alteration, then it's wrong or problematic, at least problematic. And again, I think that we have to be careful here. I am identifying two issues, the ontological and the ethical. And what I would like to say is that the ontological issue does not settle the ethical issue. It's important to discuss the ethical issue, certainly, but it doesn't settle it. So knowing that there is alteration of humanness does not mean that, therefore, whatever procedure alters humanness is wrong. In order to reach that conclusion, we need ethical arguments. We need normative claims about what is good and about what is bad, about why altering humanness is undesirable and to be prevented always, and when it might not be, and so on. So what I would like to, in closing, do is, what I'm saying is we do need, as a society, to discuss these issues instead of taking them for granted. These are questions that require a careful examination, an open debate, and a debate that engages different publics, all the stakeholders who will all be affected by these neurotechnologies. So we should all have this kind of discussion. And I'm hoping that the constitutional reform approved in Chile will be the beginning of a rich and inclusive debate on this issue as well. Thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Now we are going to hear Luca Valera. Hi, Luca, the screen is yours.
Hi, thank you, Abel, and thank you to the Universidad Alberto Hurtado for this wonderful organization. And I would like to share my screen in order to respect the 10 minutes that I have. So I will talk in this presentation about mental integrity, vulnerability, and brain manipulation, offering maybe a bioethical perspective. I will talk about protecting human identity. So in this sense, I think we have something to share with the other discussants in this panel. In recent years, due to the technological possibilities of manipulating brain activities, and with them, of the possible alteration of a personal identity, different attempts have arisen to protect human identity through national and international regulation. We may see here three important regulation proposal of regulation, and in this sense, it is worth mentioning the proposal by the European Group on Ethics in Science and Technology, which states that ICT implants in the human body should not be used to alter personal identity and manipulate mental functions. This view is motivated on the right of having one's dignity respect, which carries with it the right to respect for one's physical and mental integrity. So the word mental integrity, which I highlighted, is really important here. We have to, we can read then the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights, the Title I of the Article 3, the right to integrity of the person, which states that everyone has the right to respect for his or her physical and mental integrity. And yeah, we have to mention the proposal by the Morningside group led by Professor Yuste about the 4 neurorights to protect individuals in the technological era. I think that here is really important the issue of mental integrity. So why it is important mental integrity? In my perspective, it is important because it is really relevant at an anthropological level when talking about brain manipulation. This concept, which in a novel way describes the individuality of the human person, refers to the identity of the human subject. On the other hand, particularly focusing on the mental and not on the brain, seems to already suggest that a certain resistance to the reduction or complete identification of the human mental properties and states with brain processes. The hypothesis of my presentation is that the human being is a psychosomatic unitary individual and that its mental states cannot be reduced to its brain state as well as the mind to the brain. I can explain here this hypothesis because it would be too long, I think. Or better, we should say that mental states cannot be reduced to the mere epiphenomena of material states, such as chemical reaction in the brain. In this sense, I think it is important to retake the theory of the living being presented by the German philosopher Hans Jonas in The Phenomenon of Life. There, he introduces the fact of life as an example of the psychophysical unity which the organism exhibits, which renders the separation illusory. So we have to return then to the importance of mental integrity in defining human identity. I will try to clarify this importance from a reflection on the rights attributed to human beings, precisely concerning mental integrity. I will not try to give, as I said, an ontological justification to the matter. It will be impossible, simply. In this context of this logic of rights, Craig writes, the right to mental integrity is closely related to general notions such as liberty and autonomy that enjoy a special degree of importance in our philosophical, political, and legal tradition. In summary, we could state with Craig that the right to mental integrity is most importantly a right that protects human agency. In this sense, we may say that mental integrity is constituted as a right since it is the condition of possibility of other human dimensions such as freedom, autonomy, and agency. In short, it is necessary to protect mental integrity since with it we are protecting the sphere of human intimacy, the inner sphere of the human person. On this point, I think it is not necessary to spend more words because the reflection of the Lithuanian philosopher Emanuel Levinas have managed to express this concept clearly and explicitly. It is only worth noticing that the relationship between integrity, identity, and intimacy, each of these dimensions are the condition of possibility of the other ones. But protecting mental integrity in a certain way means also protecting their environment. In this sense, I think I want to retake Jenka and Adorno declaration. They state, as neurotechnology becomes part of the digital ecosystems and neural computation rapidly enters the infosphere, the mental integrity of individuals will be increasingly endangered if specific protective measures are not implemented. These statements force me to delve a little bit into the issue of the infosphere and the most appropriate paradigm of technology to address these issues in the current context. So in one of my papers, I explained that it could no longer simply be asserted that technology has drastically changed the human environment. Rather, as we can see from this picture, technology has become the human environment. Thus, a natural environment separate from technology does not exist. The question becomes enormously complicated then when the brain data of a human subject are inserted in a potentially uncontrolled environment, such as the infosphere. I have to retake here Luciano Floridi's very interesting philosophical speculation about the infosphere. In this sense, while full and detailed control of this continually changing and evolving environment seems almost utopian, an effort to reduce inappropriate interventions seems timely. In this sense, I will talk about the issue of vulnerability, which connects the idea of mental integrity to the environment. And one of the most important statements on human vulnerability is definitely the Article 8 of the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, which is titled Respect for Human Vulnerability and Personal Integrity. It states, in applying and advancing scientific knowledge, medical practice, and associated technologies, human vulnerability should be taken into account. Individuals and groups of special vulnerability should be protected, and the personal integrity of such individual respected. It is worth noticing that how this UNESCO declaration directly relates human vulnerability to personal integrity in the context of medical practice and new technologies, such as the context we are discussing now. So the concept of vulnerability clearly implies frailty or weakness, and simultaneously dependency and openness. Once we face this issue in this way, we have to recognize that every human being, precisely because it is a living being, is necessarily vulnerable. Thus, the feature of vulnerability may be described as a basic anthropological category, which tells us something about our fragility, dependency, and openness at the same time. As living beings, we depend both on the environment and on the complex relation we have with other living beings. So if this openness to the environment is something constitutive of the human being, the possibility of being wounded, from the Latin word vulnus, is consubstantial to the human essence. Following the UNESCO declaration, the human condition implies vulnerability. Every human being is exposed to the permanent risk of suffering wounds to their physical and mental integrity. Vulnerability is an escapable dimension of life and of individuals and the shaping of human relationships. To take into account human vulnerability acknowledges that we all may lack at some point the ability or the means to protect ourselves, our health, and our well-being. We are all confronted with the possibility of disease, disability, and environmental risks. At the same time, we live in the possibility of harm, even death, that can be caused by other human beings. This is thus the first aspect of vulnerability, which we may call the negative one, and which basically deals with our ontology. Nevertheless, there is a second aspect, which we may call the positive aspect of vulnerability, that is worth considering, following the Barcelona Declaration in 1998. It states that vulnerability is the object of a moral principle requiring care for the vulnerable. This point requires further clarifications. If the use of the concept of vulnerability to describe the human condition is quite acknowledged, its same use as an ethical or better normative concept is quite controversial. In other words, it's quite accepted that human vulnerability may be considered as the condition of possibility of any rights. That is, we need to protect the human being because it's vulnerability. Nevertheless, it is not the foundation of the rights itself, as Roberto Adorno says, which is so the relationship between integrity and vulnerability. The UNESCO Declaration is quite clear on this point. That is also why human vulnerability and personal integrity, the other essential concept evoked in the Article 8, relate to each other. When a part of our body is inappropriately touched, our life itself, or at least our health, may be threatened. When our freedom is hampered, either by adverse circumstances or by the action of others, we experience a wound to our identity, to its value and dignity. Preservation of integrity implies protection against this kind of intrusion, the capacity to say no to any sort of impingement upon our freedom or to any sort of exploitation of our body and our environment. If vulnerability then refers basically to the possibility of being wounded, from the Latin vulnus, integrity deals with the impossibility of being touched, from the Latin word tangere, which means to touch, to hit. In this regard, the mitigation or the respect of our vulnerability is a precondition to maintain our integrity. These two dimensions thus constitute the basis for the respect of human dignity and may be used both as the basic elements to ethically assess the use of neurotechnology and to protect human person. The last step I want to take here is precisely related to this protection. Why do we have to protect people's vulnerability? We may offer here two kinds of answer. First of all, we have to protect our vulnerability exactly because we need to preserve our integrity, as we said, and finally, to preserve our dignity. But there is a more interesting answer which recalls Ansiona's reflection. In this sense, we have the imperative of responsibility here. Vulnerability creates ethical concerns because we are the main cause of it. Our technological power is probably the main source of our current vulnerability. In this regard, vulnerability is ethically relevant just because it may depend on our power. In other words, retaking Jonas' insights, we are responsible of natural and human vulnerability, and this responsibility is proportionate to human power. The concept of vulnerability from the Jonasian perspective lies precisely in the intersection between power and duty, and for this reason may constitute a powerful ethical indicator for this issue of cognitive enhancement. So this presentation does not aim at offering a clear ethical response about the legitimacy of cognitive enhancement. Its aim is only to show our vulnerability, which deals with both our integrity and identity, as we said, on the one hand, and our power and duties on the other, may be used as a relevant ethical indicator when addressing the possibility to enhance human cognitive capacity. A first response about the relationship between vulnerability and enhancement, including cognitive enhancement, is a positive one. In order to reduce vulnerability, we have to enhance people's autonomy and capabilities. However, such explanation does not take into account, as Ten Have says, that vulnerability is often not an individual affair. The terminology of vulnerable population, for example, indicates that it is associated with common and shared conditions beyond the individual situation. We are talking here about justice and the possible discrimination emerging from the possibility of enhancement, obviously. But in a certain way, we are talking about appropriate environments. To take care for our vulnerability also means thus to create healthy environments where all the human beings can flourish. In this sense, the critics to enhancement as an individualistic issue perfectly makes sense. In a globalized world, an individualistic approach mainly focused on individual rights and interests is no longer sustainable. For this reason, many authors recognize that the theoretical framework to address vulnerability is provided by care ethics. This framework insists on the interdependency of human beings, thus the notion of anthropological vulnerability. The recognition of our common vulnerability represents thus the first step towards our common self-realization. I have another slide, but I want to stop here also because Immaculata talked about this issue better than I can. So I think we can discuss this issue in the final discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luca. Now we are going to hear Anna Wexler. Hi, Anna. The screen is yours.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Okay, great. I wanted to begin also by thanking the organizers for having me here today. And I also wanted to thank the panelists for a really fantastic presentation so far. So today I'm going to be talking about one example of a way that mental augmentation technology has actually made its way out into the world and some of the ethical and legal challenges that this technology has already raised and what might lie ahead in the future. And I'm going to be specifically focusing on neurostimulation and brain stimulation. And I think something to keep in mind in the back, something to keep in the back of your mind throughout this talk is a point that Dr. Melo-Martín raised about the challenges of implementation, right? So if we have this proclamation of rights, right, what does the actual implementation look like? And I think this talk might help illustrate some of those questions. So one of the main brain stimulation technologies that has been used outside of the research lab and has been available directly to consumers is something called transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS. This is a very basic diagram of a TDCS device. This is very oversimplified, but at its most basic form, there's a battery with 2 wires at the end. And when those 2 wires are connected to the scalp, there's thought to be an electrical current that flows through the brain. TDCS is different than other brain stimulation technologies you may have heard of. So in contrast to something like deep brain stimulation, which is an FDA-approved treatment for Parkinson's disease, TDCS is non-invasive, so it sits outside the skull. No neurosurgery is required. TDCS is also different from electroconvulsive therapy, which is used to treat severe depression, and that it only provides a really small fraction of the current. So it's not even clear that it's enough current to cause a single neuron to fire, whereas ECT, you're effectively causing a seizure. TDCS is not approved in the United States for any indication, and it arose about 15 years ago. And initially, when researchers first started looking at TDCS, really they divided into 2 main camps. You know, of course, there's some overlap, but scientists were really looking at it for 2 main indications. One was in clinical population, so seeing if it had any effects to treat things like depression, chronic pain, stroke, etc. But more relevant to the topic of our discussion today was that researchers were looking at the effects of TDCS in healthy populations for enhancement. So whether TDCS could improve things like motor skills, memory, creativity, problem solving, and things like that. And there were many studies that came out claiming that TDCS could provide a measure of a kind of cognitive enhancement or mental augmentation effect. I will, note briefly that the literature on TDCS and the studies on TDCS have been criticized. There's a lot of small sample size studies, not a lot of good large scale studies using very strong sham controls. But despite that, the research, using TDCS has remained strong. So here's a graph of academic publications about TDCS by year between 2004 and 2020. So you can see that there's been thousands of publications about TDCS, and there's the curve there is still climbing up. So it's a heavily researched technique. And what I want you to note from this graph is that you see around 2011, 2012 is when the curve really starts to climb. And that's when this technique began to gain quite a bit of media attention. And it was covered in many major newspapers and magazines. And it was this fact, right, this media coverage, also combined with the fact that, as I showed you in that diagram, right, it's a very easy device to make. What this led to is people doing TDCS on their own at home in what became known as DIY TDCS, or do-it-yourself TDCS. And so around late 2011, early 2012, we see blogs and websites and YouTube videos all devoted to people doing this technology at home, creating the devices and taking a video of them stimulating their own brains and posting it on YouTube. And they were doing it for 2 main reasons. I've studied this population. So one was for cognitive enhancement, to improve the things that I mentioned on the earlier slide, but also for treatment. So they're trying to self-treat things like depression. And at the early stage of do-it-yourself TDCS, it was very much, make the device from scratch kind of thing. So people were creating these devices, sharing these circuit diagrams, again, posting it on YouTube. As time went on, there are some entrepreneurial individuals who began to make devices that look like these and sell them to people. So these are TDCS device kits that you still had to have some knowledge, to put it together. But you could purchase it. You didn't have to create it totally from scratch. A few years later, what we saw, this was around 2013, 2014, was out-of-the-box wearable devices marketed for cognitive enhancement, for mental augmentation. So these were some of the marketing claims that some of these devices had: power your mind, recharge your brain, unlock your brain's true potential. And so this was the first generation on this slide right here. These devices continue to be on the market today. There's new ones that are continuously popping up here. Here are a few of the more recent ones. Many of these devices actually start out via crowdfunding, so actually raising money to launch their product. You can see the one on the bottom there. That's a Play-Doh work brain stimulator, headset marketed for boosting cognition, improving memory, focus, and creativity. And that one raised almost $500,000, right? So these are, I would say they're out there right now. There's probably about a few dozen of them that are currently on the market. I just want to note this one. This is performance enhancement, unless it's cognitive enhancement or mental augmentation. But this one has received quite a bit of funding. This is the Halo stimulator, and it's marketed for enhancement in sports, and it's been used by quite a few athletes. So, relevant to our conversation today, right? This is an example of a technology that the scientists and the researchers working on this didn't, in my view, they did not intend for this market, this mental augmentation market to arise, but it did in both a do-it-yourself and direct-to-consumer fashion. So what are some of the ethical and regulatory considerations and the challenges in this space? And so the first thing, right, is when I give a talk like this and show people examples of these technologies, they're like, well, how come that's not regulated? How are these products still allowed to be on the market today? And I will, speak about the U.S. context mostly, and that in the U.S. it's really unclear whether the FDA has authority to regulate devices that are marketed solely for cognitive enhancement. So if a device like this is out there and claiming to be able to treat a clinical indication like depression, the FDA really has clear authority. It gets a little bit trickier, and it's a little bit of a gray zone when a device is coming out and claiming to say, augment your mental status, right? The FDA does not have clear regulatory authority there, and it depends on the risk level. But that's the current situation in the US, and it's worth noting that the FDA has not taken any regulatory action against any of these devices at the moment. The approach in the EU has differed a bit. There's a relatively new medical device directive about a year old that basically says marketing claims don't matter. If your device, is acting in a certain way, if it's sending electrical current to the brain, we don't care whether it's being marketed for cognitive enhancement or a clinical indication. It's gonna be subject to some of the same medical device regulations. So I think those are some of these practical regulatory considerations that you might want to think about in terms of what implementing, a certain right may look like, and some of the challenges. In this context, there's been safety considerations, right? So even if independent of FDA, right? What are the safety considerations when someone is sending electrical current through their heads? And in my work, I found that users of these devices stimulate a lot more frequently than scientists have, in terms of, as compared to scientists who have studied the technique. There's also questions of efficacy and misleading advertising. So do these products work, right? So, and I think this is, relevant to mental augmentation as a whole, right? If a product isn't strictly regulated by an agency like an FDA, how do we know if the product's working, right? How do we assess the company claims? And I think that's really a major issue. There seems to be a gap in oversight there. Related to that is a lack of consumer understanding. So, some of these products and some mental augmentation products using neurotechnology are in major stores, at least in the US. And how is a consumer supposed to navigate some of the claims that these devices, that these companies are making on behalf of their devices, especially when they're making claims about brain function? I just wanted to briefly touch upon some broader issues, like bigger issues related to enhancement as a whole, not necessarily neurostimulation. These have all been brought up in the context of neurostimulation devices like the ones I mentioned. So fairness and cheating. And the cheating one has been quite a big one in terms of the Halo Sport device that I showed you that's used for performance or sports athletic enhancement, right? It's been called electrical doping, but it's not currently banned by any organization. It's very hard to detect. Access and inequality, right? So if these devices do work, and I think Dr. Melo-Martin's point is very good here, what are they working for? What are they enhancing relative to what, right? Then we might want to think about questions of access and inequality. Are these devices just going to exacerbate current inequalities and just be available to those with greater resources? Some have argued that there's a moral obligation to enhance in certain contexts. So if a neurostimulation device makes you more perceptive or enhances your perception or precision, perhaps surgeons have an obligation to enhance themselves. And finally, another issue that's brought up been brought up, an enhancement, right, is coerced use specifically in certain contexts, right? So, you know, again, if a product has been showing, or a technique has been shown to enhance certain functions, can, say, the military use it, you know, compel use, you know, amongst its soldiers of a certain thing. So, of a certain product. So just to conclude, right, I think it's important to note that these are issues that are not totally in the future, right? These are here right now. These are presenting these ethical questions and these regulatory challenges, and they're only going to continue, you know, not necessarily only with neurostimulation, but with other kinds of consumer neurotechnology, right? So we have major companies invest, like Facebook and Neuralink and Elon Musk, right, investing heavily in direct-to-consumer neurotechnology. The types of things that they're investing in raise, you know, all the regulatory and ethical questions that I've covered so far. So thank you very much. And I think it'll be interesting to see what lies ahead for direct-to-consumer neurotechnology that will be used for mental and cognitive augmentation. And I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'm sorry, we have a very short time for a brief discussion. Just exactly 2 minutes for one question and one short answer. So please, if you have any questions.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say something. There are many famous philosophers like Michael Sandel, for example, in his famous book Against Perfection, which argues against the enhancement, precisely focusing on the difference between therapy and enhancement. You know, I don't know what you think about this distinction, because I think that it's very difficult to draw the line in order to define what is enhancement, what is therapy. So referring to the hands of medicine is really difficult. So what about enhancement and what about the therapy? Because therapy in Michael Sandel's thought refers to a normative aspect of the human being, while enhancement no. I don't know what you think about this issue. If it's easy for you to draw the line or not, or if we have to in a certain way we have to acknowledge that we can draw the line, so it is a fictional distinction.
Is this question for the panel?
Yes, but I don't know.
I mean, Dr. Melo-Martín, I thought you encapsulated this question, or you provided a very interesting answer to it in your talk, right? Enhancing what and relative to what? And I thought that was just a really nice framing of, you know, there's so many ways that you could poke holes in this enhancement treatment distinction, but you know, relative to what? Is it relative to that individual? Is it relative to some average person that we're going to say exists, right? So I think that's the main question. I think it's super challenging to draw that line.
Right, and it's particularly interesting because, again, this right is asking for equal access to these enhancements, but it would be very strange that people don't have access to things that are necessary to get them to, you know, a lower standard. So we have a right to enhance, but not a right to just be normal or whatever that might mean. So this can create, obviously, you know, some problems.
Well, thank you very much, Immaculada, Arlene, Anna, and Luca, for this very insightful conversation on mental augmentation and human identity. And well, after a short break, we will have session E on mental privacy. So see you in a few minutes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to session E. In this session, we will be discussing issues related to the right to mental privacy. That is, the idea that any data obtained from measuring neural activity should be kept private, and moreover, the sale, commercial transfer, and use of neural data should be strictly regulated. We will hear comments by Jacques Galland and Marcelo Yenka. Jacques Galland is the Chancellor's Professor of Psychology at the University of California at Berkeley, and he is affiliated with several other departments and graduate programs at UCB, such as neuroscience, biophysics, and vision science. His current research program focuses on computational modeling and mapping of human brain activity under a wide variety of naturalistic conditions. Marcelo Yenka is a senior researcher at the Laboratory of Ethics and Health Policy of the Department of Health Sciences and Technology of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. His research focuses on ethics and governance of biomedical data, ethical development of artificial intelligence, neuroethics, and responsible innovation of emerging technologies at the human-machine interface. Now we are going to hear Jacques Galland. Hello, Jacques. The screen is yours.
Hello, Abel. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I want to thank the organizers for arranging this wonderful conference. I think this is a very, very important issue. Right now, sorry, my screen is behind. There we go. At the moment, I think our brain privacy is, adequately, I guess, covered by current regulations involving human subjects. But what I want to argue in this talk is that as the neurotechnologies develop, the need for brain privacy and the need to respect brain privacy and regulate brain data will become increasingly important. So I'm going to talk mostly today about non-invasive neurotechnologies. Invasive neurotechnologies involve electrodes that are implanted in the brains of a patient, but in the long run, the largest, I think, volume of brain data will eventually come from non-invasive neurotechnologies, which are wearables that just normal people carry around with them, wear with them on the street. So, the brain is a fairly complicated device. It's a 3-pound organ that consists of hundreds of different areas and structures that are arranged in a network that is exceedingly complicated. Because there are hundreds of different pieces of the brain, and because individual differences are reflected in the structure and function of the brain, then the individual differences between humans are reflected in individual differences in brain anatomy and brain function. And this slide shows 8 different brains from 8 individuals, but each pair of brains is actually from a twin. So you can see in the top left, there are 2 pairs of brains that are from twins, and they are similar but not identical. So you can see that all 8 of these pairs of brains are quite different from one another. And you could, if you had an anatomical MRI of an individual person, you could match it to a new anatomical image of their brain in order to identify individual humans from their brain anatomy, including twins. So brain anatomy is completely individual and completely identifiable. It serves as a fingerprint for an individual human. This is true for both anatomy, but it's also true for other kinds of brain-based biomarkers. So it's becoming increasingly common. On the next slide, you'll see that it's becoming increasingly common for people to undergo biomarker scans to identify specific neurological diseases. So in this slide, we see an Alzheimer's disease patient on the left and a neurotypical control subject on the right. And this is a PET image that shows a specific biomarker that is diagnostic of Alzheimer's disease. So as patients present with different kinds of neurological diseases, they will have different patterns in these various biomarkers that can be used to identify their disease state. So we can use anatomy and biomarkers both to identify individual subjects and to identify specific kinds of brain states in those subjects. But the sort of most complicated and in some ways scary technology that is upcoming is non-invasive human imaging by means of functional MRI or other functional brain methods. So this movie that you see on the next slide shows a brain, and the brain is kind of inconveniently folded up inside the skull. So we inflate the brain and then we can flatten it out. So here you can see the left hemisphere on the left and the right hemisphere on the right. The back of the brain is actually in the middle of this slide, and the prefrontal cortex, the front of the brain, is at the far left and far right. And painted on this flat map are red and blue areas that indicate higher brain activity and lower brain activity. And in this simple demonstration, the subject is simply in an MRI machine, and they are watching the movie that is shown at the top of the slide. This movie it doesn't have any words, it's just a silent movie, but you can see that it has a lot of complicated content in it. And as the humans watch this movie, you see different patterns of brain activity that seem to swirl and boil and change over time. Sometimes when something boring is on the screen, like a smokestack or a car tailpipe, the amount of brain activity is fairly low. Other times when there is something more interesting on the screen, like two humans talking to one another, then you will see that the brain activity is very high. Everything that you see or hear or think about, or any motor action that you make, any decision that you make, is reflected in some complicated pattern of brain activity that can be measured using functional MRI or other similar non-invasive brain technologies. And once we can develop a essentially dictionary that allows us to translate between brain activity and certain kinds of information or concepts that are represented in the brain, then we can potentially decode all kinds of content in the brain. So this shows 4 brain activity maps from 4 different subjects, and here we're color coding the different locations in the brain according to the concepts that are represented when people listen to narrative speech. Red indicates social concepts, blue indicates concepts having to do with places, green indicates concepts having to do with the structure of the environment. So you can see that these 4 maps are both similar and different. There is about 30% of the variability across these individual people is captured by the group model. They have it in common, and about 70% of the functional variability it reflects individual differences. And if we have a functional map from an individual person, we can identify who that person is and what they are thinking or perceiving with a very high degree of accuracy. We can use these maps to identify the representation of individual concepts. So for example, this is a map for the concept of dog. If you hear about a dog or see a dog in a movie or start thinking about a dog, some subset of these brain areas shown in red will become active. And if you notice, there are on this slide, there are 1, 2, 3, maybe 6 or 7 different locations that are red, indicating that the concept of dog is not represented in one location in the brain, but is represented as a constellation of functional and anatomical brain areas that all work together to represent the concept of dog. And that is because when you think about a dog, different aspects of dogness are stored and represented in different aspects of the brain. Parts of the brain near the visual system will represent how a dog looks. Parts of the brain near the auditory system will represent how a dog sounds. Parts of the brain in the frontal cortex will represent your thoughts about dogs, whether you like them or don't like them, and so on. So the worrisome thing as far as brain privacy goes is that neurotechnologies that are developed to measure the brain in order to solve neurological problems and to push basic science forward can all be used to decode the brain. There's a fundamental symmetry between encoding and decoding. So in the models that I just showed you, we went from some stimulus into some response, and we built a model that allowed us to take a stimulus and predict a brain response. But once we have that model, we can turn it into a decoder where we take a brain response and invert it and recover the stimulus. That means that any brain measurements we make can be used to decode the brain. So as medicine proceeds and we develop better methods for measuring the brain in order to treat neurological diseases, we will inevitably be able to decode the brain better. These two things go together and they cannot be taken apart. This just shows you some decoding results from the brain. This slide shows a movie on the right. Sorry, the movie seems to be a bit wonky. There's a movie on the right and some decoded concepts that we are recovering from brain activity from decoding just one specific part of the brain that represents the abstract semantic content of a movie. On the left, we have a presented movie in the upper left, and on the upper right, you can see the decoded movie. And on the bottom, we're just showing you the edge maps to show that this decoder actually works fairly well. In this case, on the left, we're decoding from one simple visual area that only represents edges and textures. So there's a lot of information we can decode from the brain. This is just a static example in case the movie didn't work. So non-invasive neuroimaging. This is a slide that shows actually the very first photograph that was ever taken. This is in the south of France in 1826. And the reason I'm showing you this is to get across the idea that non-invasive neuroimaging is still in its infancy. We are at a stage of technology that is analogous to early photography. This photograph isn't very good. No one would pay money for this photograph. But of course, now 200 years later, we have photography that is so good that you get it for free on your cell phone, and it works fantastically well. And that is also going to be the trajectory for non-invasive brain technologies. As technology develops, we will get better and better ability to measure the brain functionally, and we will be able to create more detailed functional maps. And of course, those will be more individually identifying. There are 4 factors that limit the technology: the type of information that's to be decoded, the quality of the brain measurements, the accuracy of the models, and computational power. And of these 4 factors, the only one that really impedes our ability to measure and understand and decode everything in the brain is the quality of brain activity measurements. So in the future, we're going to push these technologies forward. We're going to do this to improve medical diagnosis, to be able to address issues of mental health like depression and Alzheimer's disease and autism spectrum disorder and other kinds of brain disorders. And we're going to probably use these technologies to create ubiquitous brain-computer interfaces. And the reason for this is the technology community has a very strong interest in creating non-invasive brain decoding devices. So this slide just shows somebody handling their cell phone. And as you all know, the way we communicate with our cell phone right now is that you have to use your thumbs to type on a keyboard. And that is obviously a very silly and poor way to interface with a phone. What every technology company would like is for you to just wear a headset that will allow you to think to your phone and just talk to it directly through thought. And there are many groups that are pushing that forward, and it's just a matter of time before we get something like that, and it exists in the marketplace. So there are a lot of ethical implications of this kind of thing. As we all know, people in the Western world are very poor at understanding their privacy, and they're very poor at handling it and guarding it and safeguarding it. And when the technology is available for allowing ubiquitous brain decoding, you can imagine that people all over will be wearing these headsets and talking to their phones continuously. But if Google can decode your internal covert thought, so if you think to yourself, call my wife, and then you have a conversation with her just in your head, then Google can also recover anything else in your brain that that you may not even know about. So for example, you might be thinking now after a long day at this conference that you would like to have a coffee, and maybe you didn't consciously think that you wanted a coffee before I mentioned it to you, but somewhere in your brain, there might be some part of your brain that says, gee, I would really like a coffee now, and that has not reached consciousness. If there is any kind of covert thought that is in brain activity, even if it's not conscious, then that can potentially be decoded. So I just want to point out that neuroscientists are taking these issues very seriously, and we also want you as a government community to take these issues seriously. This onrush of neurotechnology is very worrisome because, like any other technology, it can be used for good or it can be used for ill. We don't know when these ubiquitous, non-invasive brain decoding technologies will emerge. It will probably on the order of 20 to 50 years. But at some point in the future, we will be able to measure brain activity in very high resolution. And at that point, it's going to be incumbent on government and regulators to ensure that these technologies are used correctly. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jack. Now we are going to hear Marcelo Yenka. Hello, Marcelo. The screen is yours.
Muchas gracias, Abel, por la introducción y buenos días a todos los amigos chilenos. Also, an extended thank you to the Chilean Senate, to Rafael Yuste, and to the Universidad Alberto Hurtado for inviting me to this exciting and very timely conference on neuro rights. So I'm now sharing my screen. I have the big privilege of speaking right after Jack Gallen's fantastic overview of the current capabilities of neurotechnology and their implications for mental privacy. I will try to complement Jack's presentation from an ethical and philosophical angle. In particular, I would like to clarify some of the conceptual prerequisites of the notion of mental privacy and try to make a case for considering mental privacy as a fundamental human right. In order to properly understand the notion of mental privacy, it's probably useful to take first a step back and look at the broader notion of privacy that mental privacy is part of. So, as many people in the audience know, one of the oldest and most influential formulations of privacy dates back to the end of the 19th century, in particular to the work of Warren and Brandeis, who described the right to privacy as the right to be let alone. And since then, philosophers and lawyers have long debated about the actual meaning of being let alone. And one of the most influential and well-accepted interpretations of the right to be let alone is that privacy actually, so being let alone means the condition of being protected from unwanted access by others. And as technology developed, so Warren and Brandeis were writing at the beginning of the mainstream media industry, so newspapers and magazines. Since then, technology has evolved. We had the television and then the early prototypes of the internet. And philosophers and lawyers have started to realize that there are several domains of human activity where this condition of being protected from unwanted access may become relevant. The most important of which, for the purposes of this conference, is the domain of personal information. And so scholars started to conceptualize a subtype of privacy, which is related to information, and this was called informational privacy. And one interesting feature of information privacy is that, as Charles Fried famously put it, it's not simply an absence of information about us in the minds of others, but it's also the control we have over information about ourselves. Another distinction that I would like to draw, which I believe is useful to understand mental privacy, is the distinction between data and information. This is a quite obvious distinction for people working in data science, but in everyday language, in the lay language, we tend to use these two terms interchangeably. But there is an important distinction. Data are individual units that contain raw, unorganized facts that need to be processed. And this goes back to the Latin word datum, which means that which is given. Only after we process data, we obtain this process organized set of data that collectively carry a logical meaning. So data themselves do not carry a logical meaning, but information does. And information is process organized data. To give you a simple example, what you see on the left is data, is a collection of measurements from GPS. What you see on the right is information. It's the processing of those data in order to develop a trajectory, an interactive map of the places and the times where a certain person has been on a specific day. And as you can see, the information on the right is something that carries privacy sensitivity, that carries relevance from a privacy perspective. But this privacy relevance only arises after we process the raw data. Now, if we apply, if we buy this analogy and we try to apply it to the brain and mind domain, then we can draw the distinction between brain data and mental information. Brain data are individual raw measurements of human brain structure, activity, and function that need to be processed. And once we process and organize them, then we can generate logical meaning about mental states, such as thoughts, memories, emotions, and so on. This is an extract from the beautiful videos that Jack Gallants has just presented. So based on this analogy, we can say that all the raw measurements, say fMRI or structural MRI or EEG or ECOG, are the raw brain data. And then if you're good enough, as good as Jack Gallants and his team, then you can analyze this data in order to generate mental information. In this particular case, is semantic and visual information, respectively. Now, if we accept this analogy, then we need also to draw another important distinction, which is the distinction between neuroprivacy and mental privacy. Again, these are two terms that are often used interchangeably in the neuroethics debate, but they actually, they are, of course, two terms that have a very important overlap. That's why I've presented them in a Venn diagram with a significant area of overlap, but I would argue they're not supervenient. And this is because neuroprivacy concerns the protection of brain data, also called neural data, whereas mental privacy concerns the protection of mental information. Now, it's important to keep in mind that not all neuroprivacy challenges have to do with mental information, and vice versa, not all mental privacy challenges have to do with brain data. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So Jack has mentioned this very interesting line of research on identifying neuroimaging biomarkers of brain disorders. Here is a recent paper on neuroimaging biomarkers of schizophrenia. There is also very good research going on in the field of biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is typically something that has privacy sensitivity. So it can generate challenges from the perspective of neuroprivacy. Imagine, for example, if your information about your neuroimaging biomarkers of dementia or schizophrenia fall into the wrong hands, like in the hands of your employer or health insurance provider. This can lead, to an early job termination, or your health insurance provider can adapt your premiums accordingly. But this has nothing to do with mental information. There is no decoding of mental information in any significant sense. On the other hand, you can have mental privacy without neuroprivacy. This is the case, for example, of a field of artificial intelligence known as emotion AI, also called affective computing, where you can basically use a lot of sources of non-neural data, such as from natural language processing, eye tracking, facial expressions, and so on, to reveal information about mental states, especially to detect and analyze emotions. So this is just a simple taxonomy of threats to respectively neuroprivacy and mental privacy. In the relation to neuroprivacy, we have observed potential risks for collecting redundant data during brain recording. This is exactly what Jack was mentioning related to Google. You can collect information for a certain purpose, but you can also access redundant information. This is, for example, something relevant for the ethics of neuromarketing studies. There's also the risk of repurposing and recontextualizing brain data. The problem of collecting brain data under weak consent regimes. This is something that concerns especially the domain of consumer neurotechnology, where a lot of direct-to-consumer devices can be used by only accepting the terms of service of the product, which rarely qualify as adequate informed consent and are rarely read by the users. And then finally, you have cybersecurity vulnerabilities. This is what Pima Salaga and I have called the risk of malicious hacking of brain-computer interfaces, but it also applies not only to the devices, but also to the data repositories to which the devices are connected. Threats to mental privacy apply to all of the above, but also to the unauthorized inferences that can be drawn from the processing of both brain data and non-neural data. Now, if we look into more granularly, more in detail at mental privacy, I think there is an interesting distinction that we can draw on and can also help us understand the time frame of ethical concerns related to mental privacy. Borrowing the distinction between narrow sense and broad sense from Noam Chomsky's theory of language, we can distinguish mental privacy in the narrow sense from a mental privacy in the broad sense. Now, mental privacy in the narrow sense is the act of decoding the content of mental states through a process that Russ Poldrack has called the reverse inference. Now, this is what most people talking about mental privacy refer to, and it's what has been popularized under the label of mind reading. But there is also a mental privacy in the broad sense, which encompasses any act of revealing privacy-sensitive statistical correlations between certain data aggregations and certain mental states. Now, decoding the content of mental states is an ethical concern that I think is very justified and plausible, but it's very much foresight, future-oriented, because today we have limited capabilities for decoding the content, the semantic or visual content of mental states. But we will get there. I concur with Jack that there is no scientific reason why we should believe that we will never be able to achieve that degree of comprehension of the language of the human brain. And if we understand the language of the human brain, then we can also understand and reveal how mental states are encoded in the brain. But we need to keep in mind that mental privacy in the broad sense is a very much pressing and concrete concern that is already valid today, and for which we do not have adequate regulatory and ethical infrastructures. Mental privacy in the broad sense is particularly exacerbated in the context of brain data, of big data. So big data refers to any large data set that is so large in variety and volume that can only be analyzed using complex computational tools. And brain data are increasingly becoming part of the broader big data ecosystem. In the last few years, we are seeing an increase in volume and variety of both brain data and mental information in the digital ecosystem due to neuromarketing, consumer neurotechnology, effective computing, etc. We also have an increased possibility of aggregating brain data with non-neural data related to mental states and behavior. If you connect your direct-to-consumer EEG while you're on the internet, then you can in principle establish associations between your online behavior and patterns of brain activity. We have, most importantly, an increased inferential power of machine learning models for predictive and retrospective data analysis. And this also generates an increased possibility to make privacy-sensitive inferences from non-sensitive data. This is a well-known phenomenon in big data. Typical example, you can infer someone's pregnancy status from the purchases they do on Amazon. So the purchase itself is relatively non-sensitive, but you can do retrospective data mining to reveal privacy-sensitive inferences. And the same risk applies to seemingly non-sensitive brain-related data. And finally, we need to keep in mind that the data collected today are here to stay. So they will continue to be processed in the future when we will have better computational models to analyze them. And the increased availability of brain data in the consumer market also raises the ethical challenge of the commodification of brain data. So the more profit-oriented industry actors enter the neurotechnology game, the higher the chances that brain data will become a commodity that is sought after for profit-oriented activities, something I've called neurocapitalism. Now, there are a few common objections to concerns related to mental privacy. I'll just tackle three. One is that we should not worry too much about mental privacy because current consumer neurotech devices lack efficacy. Another one is that non-neural data are a greater source of risk to mental privacy. And the third one is that mind reading is not possible. Now, I would argue that the first two concerns are a typical example of an informal fallacy known as a false dichotomy. So I would agree with both statements, but these statements are not mutually exclusive with the fact that we need to worry about mental privacy. The fact, for example, that consumer neurotech devices lack efficacy is something that has been widely studied, among others by Anna Wexler. But we do not worry about privacy because of performance. We do worry about privacy because of the amount and quality of data that are collected. I'll give you an example. Many people will know this app. This is Face app. This is an app that was and is very popular. And the point of the app is that it makes you look like an old person. So it makes young people look like older persons. And as you can see, the problem with the privacy problem of this app is not that it's accurate at revealing how we actually look like in the future. Probably it's entirely inaccurate. We don't know. But the point is that it can collect high quality sensitive data, which is your passport level headshots. And this information about your face is used to train algorithms for training. The second concern that non-neural data are a greater source of risk to mental privacy, again, is something that is true at the moment. It's much easier to infer mental states from online behavior and your likes on Facebook than on, say, based on EEG. But again, this is not a mutual exclusion because it's just a contingency of the current level of development of technology. But as neurotechnology increases in accuracy and computational power, we will likely reach a point where brain data can offer more insights compared to non-neural data. And then finally, the argument that mind reading is not possible is subject to what a formal logical fallacy known as a modal fallacy. Namely, something that confuses contingent from a necessary claim. Mind reading is currently not possible given a number of variables, which include the current level of technology development, the quality of the brain recordings, and also some other contextual variables. But as I mentioned before, there is no scientific reasons why we should assume that mind reading is logically impossible. So based on these considerations, it can be, I would posit the argument that mental privacy can be understood as a basic human right. And this is based on a number of observations and arguments that have been made in the field of legal philosophy and normative ethics. One is that mental privacy is a necessary precondition for the development and preservation of personhood. It is also a prerequisite for the development of a sense of self-identity, which has been defined by Altman as what defines and limits the boundaries of the self. Mental privacy is also necessary for the recognition of one's ownership of his or her physical and mental reality, and a moral right to his or her self-determination. And unsurprisingly, there is a high convergence on mental privacy within the neuro-rights debate. Rafael Yuste and I often discuss the sets of neuro-rights that we have respectively suggested, and indeed, mental privacy is the one where we have 100% of agreements. And this intimate link between mental privacy and the notion of personhood and the role it plays in developing a sense of self-identity and mental self-determination, I think it's well captured by this very old quote by Paracelsus, who wrote in the 16th century, thoughts are free and are subject to no rule. On them rests the freedom of man, and they tower over the light of nature. So what regulatory options are available to protect mental privacy? It should be noted that a call for new expanded regulation for neuroprivacy was made already in 2005 by the Committee on Science and Law. Unfortunately, since then, we haven't seen any development at the level of binding regulation, so mandatory governance, until the Chilean bill, to which I applaud. We can identify two different regulatory options, those that are data-oriented from those that are inference-oriented. Data-oriented regulatory solutions should be aimed at situating brain data within international data protection law. Ideally at the level of the EU GDPR, which is currently setting the highest bar for data protection law internationally. One option that has been advocated is considering brain data as a special data category within the GDPR, analogously to genetic data, which are currently a special category of health data under the GDPR. A radical proposal that has been made by the Chilean neuroprotection bill is to consider brain data in analogy with organs. And there are also more conservative approaches that look at evolutionary interpretations of the current data protection provisions on personal data in order to account for more parsimoniously for brain data. In terms of inference-oriented regulation, what can be pursued is a holistic approach to mental privacy, which looks not only at data types, but also at inferences. From this perspective, mental privacy impact assessments could be considered as a requirement for responsible innovation in neurotechnology. And at a more fundamental level, we can explore the anchoring of mental privacy to international human rights law, in particular to the European Convention on Human Rights and Article 8 and 9, which pertain respectively to the right to respect for private life and freedom of thought. We should keep in mind, however, that this will be a delicate balancing act between mental privacy and cognitive liberty, and that we need to focus not just on restricting access to information, but also on enabling higher degrees of control that people have over the information themselves. And I would actually argue it's very important that any debate on regulation is not focusing excessively on restrictions, because we need to collect brain data. We cannot cure what we cannot measure. So we need to expand our measurements of the brain in order to treat neurological disorders which currently affect hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And we also need to expand the volume and variety of data that are available for predictive and retrospective analysis. But we need to do so in a way that is ethically aligned and privacy conscious. And I would like to point out that in this respect, in relation to data protection, the Italian Data Protection Authority has devoted the 2021 Privacy Day to the topic of mental privacy and neuro rights, which is, I think, a laudable development. Finally, there are also technical solutions that we can explore. So regulation is good. But it should be complemented with also bottom-up approaches to fix the technical weaknesses of the current data infrastructures. And what we can currently explore is enhancing the security standards of both neurotechnology devices and data sharing infrastructures, enhancing people's control over their data and mental information, for example, by reforming consent standards for consumer applications, and also leveraging advanced privacy-preserving technologies such as differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, and secure multi-party computation. And there is a lot of very exciting research that is being conducted in this field. Finally, I just would like to emphasize that governance at the national level is fundamental, but we cannot tackle global problems at the national level only. Global problems require global solutions. So I also would like to inform the audience about current developments at the level of intergovernmental organizations. In particular, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation, the OECD, has released in 2019 a recommendation of the Council on Responsible Innovation in Neurotechnology, which is the product of a 5-year process and sets the first international standards in the field. It has been ratified by the OECD member states, which, as you can see, include most European and North American countries, as well as Chile and other Asian and Oceanian countries. And also other organizations, such as the International Bioethics Committee of the UNESCO and the Bioethics Committee of the Council of Europe are developing strategic action plans and working groups to look at mental privacy and neuro rights more broadly. So with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will stop sharing my slides.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcelo and Jacques, for your wonderful presentations. Now we have some minutes for a conversation. So if you have any questions or comments. I have a brief question regarding, for any of you, regarding what you say, Marcelo, about the Chilean proposal regarding neural data that is treating, applying to it the regulations for organs extraction and transplantation. Do you think that there is any particular situation in which neural data should not be commercialized, or how do you think it would be regulated, the issue of neural data commercialization?
I think it's a very good question, and it's a difficult one, because on the one hand, it can be argued that commodifying brain data means commodifying the most intimate part of our self, and the neurobiological correlates of what we are. But at the same time, I am a passionate supporter of personal autonomy, and in particular of cognitive liberty. So I am not so sympathetic with top-down paternalistic approaches that tell people what they should do with their data. I think people should have the right to make free and competent decisions about their data, provided they are adults and mentally competent. So it's a difficult dilemma, which I think can hardly be resolved in a priori way. I think we need to have an adaptive approach to governance, which also looks at what can be done with the data at any given stage, and what degree of control people have in order to make decisions about their brain data. My concerns right now is that most people who will become users of consumer neurotechnology applications in the years to come will not have sufficient awareness of the implications that this will raise. As Jack has said, people are very keen on trading privacy for services. The Face app that I just showed you, it's a good example, right? People are willing to share the best quality image of their faces in order to get a very, very, irrelevant and seemingly silly service, which is, looking at themselves with aged face. You can easily imagine that companies may want to exploit this similar channel in order to collect brain-related data from consumer neurotechnologies in the future. So I think increasing awareness and also the control that people have over their data will become increasingly important.
Let me just add something to that. First of all, Marcello gave a really fantastic talk and overview of this, and I agree with everything he said. I do want to point out that there are some things we could do when we think about commercializing brain data that simply change essentially the routine practice, so that essentially companies have to jump through more hoops to ensure privacy and to be consistent with principles of privacy, and that the users are better protected. And one of the principles should be that users own their data, and they own their data forever. And there should be a chain of custody for the data. So for example, you might want to put individual brain data on the blockchain, so that not only can you look at any time at your data, but you can see who else has ever looked at or touched that data, so that you have essentially a chain of evidence. Your data has not escaped into the wild. Secondly, all services associated with neural data should be opt-in rather than opt-out. Currently, the default for most commercial services is opt-out. If you sign the EULA, which of course no one reads, then you've opted into, you've basically agreed to do a whole bunch of things that you don't even know what they are. And if you want to opt out, it's oftentimes difficult. Brain data should be exactly the opposite. There should be hurdles put in the way of commercialization that prevent companies from using brain data unless the user, the owner of that brain data, has given explicit consent for a specific purpose. And there are other ways we could arrange the sort of landscape of data sharing, data brokerage, data use that would also continue to ensure brain privacy. These will, of course, make things less efficient for the companies, but that's the cost of doing business.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Thank you both. And just one quick last question. Marcello made a distinction between brain data and mental data, or brain information and mental information. This question is also for both of you. Do you think that there is a difference in sensitivity between mental and brain data, and consequently there should be a difference in the regulations? We should can regulate it, both kind of data in the same way?
Well, I guess I can speak to that quickly. Marcello probably has things to add too. He's clearly thought about these issues a lot. I think I'm not an ethicist, so from my naive neuroscience perspective, the first kind of data that Marcello was talking about was, biomarkers and anatomy. Those are data that provide information about individual differences. They can be used to identify individual people, just like your iris scan or your fingerprints or your DNA, and they have to be protected in that sense, in the sense that we don't want individuals to be identified unless they choose to be identified in general. The second stage has to do with biomarkers. If you have, say, a biomarker that can detect Alzheimer's disease before there are any behavioral symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, that's obviously important information for you personally, but it may also be, as Marcello pointed out, of interest to an employer or to the government. And, I think that we have to guard against malign uses of that kind of information. But mental data about mental states and decoding thought, that's a whole different sort of order of information, because everything that you ever think about, consciously and unconsciously, is potentially decodable. Essentially, anything that is in active working brain circuitry is potentially decodable. There are some things that we can't decode, and we don't know when we'll be able to decode them. I ask you to think about the name of your kindergarten teacher, or your first grade teacher. You can probably think about that person's name after a few minutes. You might be able to come up with their name, but you probably haven't thought about that in a while. And so that information in long-term memory was locked away in your brain somehow in the synaptic connections. And neuroscientists don't really understand how those long-term memories are stored, or where they're stored, or how you would ever read them out. But the minute I ask you, hey, what's the name of your first grade teacher, and you form a mental concept of that, then it's now a concept that is in working active brain circuits, and it's percolating around in your brain, and there's all kinds of associations and representations of information related to your first grade teacher that all of a sudden become apparent, and that is potentially decodable. The only limit to decoding brain activity is essentially a measurement limitation, and the question of building a dictionary for an individual person as opposed to the group. But those are just technical limitations. There's nothing conceptually limiting there. So it's very dangerous technology.
Yeah, I agree 100% with Jack, and I also wanted to clarify one point. By distinguishing brain data from mental information, I don't want to give the false impression that I'm arguing in favor of a dualistic ontology of the mind, where you have the brain on the one side and the mind on the other. I wanted to highlight the fact that not all information that you can extract from the brain relates to the mind. So as I was mentioning before, if you just have a neuroimaging biomarker that shows you a predisposition to develop Alzheimer's dementia, then you are revealing privacy sensitive information, but you are not decoding any mental states in any significant sense. So you're not accessing someone's memories or someone's emotions. But brain data and mental data often overlap. So when and anytime we reveal mental information from brain recordings, we have both mental privacy and neuroprivacy at stake. So I think this is probably useful for the audience to clarify. And I do agree that so neuroprivacy challenges are very important. So they, if information about your brain health goes into the wrong hands, that can have quite big consequences for you. But these consequences don't differ in quality from the consequences of having your genetic information or other physiological information falling into the wrong hands. Whereas mental information is new to the extent that we were not able to decode information about mental states from the very source of those mental states, which is the underlying neurobiological function and activity.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jack and Marcelo, for this very insightful conversation on mental privacy. And thank you all for assisting the second day of the workshop, Neurorights in Chile, the philosophical debate. Tomorrow will be the workshop's third and last day, where we will have a closing session discussing the possibility that neurorights serve as a stepping stone for the new Chilean constitution and for a new international declaration of human rights. We will hear comments by Jared Chenser, Alan McKay, Eduardo Aldunate, and Ciro Colombara. And the session will be moderated by Rafael Yuste. I hope you have a very nice day and see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Abel.